Just before the Second World War, one of the most significant finds of English archaeology was made in Suffolk, at the country house of Sutton Hoo. This was the excavation of what is now known as Mound One, one of more than a dozen mounds in the grounds of the house. The mound field is located on a piece of high ground overlooking the river Deben, which flows 10 miles downstream into the North Sea. It was in 1938 that Mrs Edith Pretty, the owner of Sutton Hoo, hired a local self-taught archaeologist called Basil Brown to do the excavation.
What sparked Mrs Pretty's interest into researching the site here was this story one of her friends, one of her guests reported, when they said they got up during the night and looked out the window and saw these ghostly warriors riding round one of these mounds.
At the start, Basil Brown did not know what he was going to be dealing with.
They knew that the barrows were there, all these humps and bumps in this field there, but they had no idea to which period they belonged, and of course no idea of the wealth that one of the mounds was going to yield. Right, so here we are at Mound One.
Although he had no formal training, Basil Brown was a careful and methodical excavator.
In 1938, Basil came onto the site and said to Mrs Pretty, "Where would you like us to dig?" She pointed here. This is the one her friend had said had seen these ghosts riding around. But Basil could see it was the largest of the mounds. He could also see it was an uneven shape. You could see the far end had been disturbed. So he wanted to open up some of the smaller mounds first to see what they were looking at, what sort of period they were looking at.
It soon became clear he was not the first to investigate the mounds.
The 3 mounds he'd opened had all been opened in the past, and their findings had never been recorded, so we say they've been robbed in the past.
One of the mounds excavated that first summer was Mound 2. This has since been reconstructed when Sutton Hoo was re-excavated in the 1990s.
What Mound 2 is a piece of modern experimental archaeology. When Professor Martin Carver from York University finished his excavations here in 1992, he decided to reconstruct a burial mound to see how it would weather, what would happen to it. It's already lost its height, it's lost a couple of metres in height, it's lost its shape, and it's taken on its very rugged appearance with all this gorse growing on it. So it's really changing its shape and appearance every time we come out.
In Mound 2, Basil Brown found pieces of iron, which he realised were rivets that had once held together the planks of a ship. The wood had long since rotted away, and what was worse, in the Middle Ages Mound 2 had been used as a rabbit warren. The action of the rabbits had scattered the ironwork all over the place.
So Basil couldn't see what was going on, he couldn't work out what was what.
It had been a somewhat disappointing summer, especially as all the mounds Basil opened had been plundered in the past.
It seems that what had happened back in the 16th century was that Queen Elizabeth and her father, Henry VIII, had given licence to men to go around the countryside opening sites like these because they knew quite often they'd find gold, silver and jewellery.
Nevertheless, Basil had made one important discovery. The mounds dated from the early Anglo-Saxon period.
Who were these Anglo-Saxons? Well, they were a river-faring people, a sea people, which is why I say they would enjoy a view like this, overlooking the river there, the Deben, controlling the approach, if you like, to the royal residence at Rendlesham, a couple of miles upstream, and being 10 miles from the sea, North Sea, down at Felixstowe and Bawdsey Ferry down that way.
The Anglo-Saxons came to this area in the 5th and 6th centuries, the traditional Dark Ages. This was after the fall of Roman Britain, but before the Vikings and long before the Norman conquest.
Around about 410 AD, the Romans left behind this province of Britannia to go back to defend the continental empire. Now, of course, the Romans had every intention of coming back to reclaim Britannia, but for one reason or another, they never got round to it, so that left behind this vacuum of power. Now, these various North Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, crossed the North Sea through the 5th century to fill in this vacuum of power. So these Germanic tribes started carving out kingdoms for themselves. It was the Angles then who came to settle here and to give their name to this kingdom of the East Angles. And eventually the Angles come to give their name to the whole country, England. England is Angleland. So these people then, crossing after the Romans have left, are the first people to identify themselves as English and the first people to speak English.
In the summer of 1939, Mrs Pretty rehired Basil Brown to continue his investigations. On the continent, the Nazis were increasingly threatening the European peace. By the beginning of September, Britain was destined to be at war with Germany. This year Basil was ready to excavate Mound One, where one of the labourers soon found another ship's rivet.
I found a bit of iron, sir.
Getting on his hands and knees, Basil explored the surrounding area.
Very, very carefully removing the soil from these ship rivets, and he found that these ones were still in place.
Although the actual ship was long gone, Basil Brown uncovered its ghostly presence in the soil. And while he found more evidence of mound robbers, it seemed this time they had missed their target.
The robbers found the centre of the mound as it stood in 1600, but that was not the original centre of the mound. Had they dug just 2 or 3 feet further this way, they would have found the central burial chamber.
Basil told only Guy Maynard of the Ipswich Museum about the possibility of the Mound One treasure being intact.
He tried to keep everything very quiet because he didn't want people just coming up from the road and seeing what was going on. He knew this was going to be a major discovery.
But Basil's activities were about to be rudely interrupted.
Basil and Guy Maynard between them hadn't reckoned on how small the circles of academia must have been, especially back in 1939, because both of them have made inquiries to various libraries and museums about ship burials, to see how they should go about excavating a ship burial and what they could expect to find.
Once news of these inquiries got out, it was not long before professional archaeologists got involved and had themselves appointed to take over the dig. However, Mrs Pretty ensured that Basil was kept on board. Now the excavation of the burial chamber began.
They were very, very carefully digging down with flat-bladed shovels so as not to cause too much damage as they went. But if you listen to some of the audio recordings on the little telephone things in the exhibition hall, you hear, I think it's W.F. Grimes, talking about just gold leaf just blowing around in the wind.
In just a few days, the professionals unearthed a whole series of rare and expensive objects. This had surely been the burial of a powerful king, sent into the afterlife with a rich array of provisions and equipment.
At the back end of the grave, they found the symbols of office, symbols of power and status, the standard, the sceptre, this giant shield. Now, at the front end of the grave, the more domestic items, these stacks of silver dishes, these great yew wood buckets, the great cauldron over here would have hung from the wall of the chamber at one time with its suspension chain. Now, in the centre here, the more personal items. The helmet smashed into hundreds of pieces, the sword bent as if something heavy had landed on it, the belt, well, the belt had gone because it was made of leather, rotted away, but the great buckle, the archaeologists took it out of the ground. It still worked. They could open it up, put a belt on it today, you could wear it, you could use it. It weighs about £1, but it's, so you'd know it was there. There's a little space in the back where there's a cover that slides across where you could store maybe a relic, a bone of an ancestor or something like this. Still working after 1600 years in the ground. So the gold buckle then would have held the belt there, and then there was all these fittings, these gold and garnet fittings coming down off the belt to hold the sword scabbard in place and so on. There was the purse lid. The purse itself presumably made of leather because again rotted away, but the gold and garnet fittings off the lid still in place, and beneath them all these coins. 37 gold coins, all from different mints in France. Personal favourite from the grave are the shoulder clasps. I feel the most exquisite piece found definitely from this grave, if not from any archaeological site in the country. Now again, they still worked when they took them out of the ground. These shoulder clasps then, one on each shoulder, holding together 2 pieces of armour. On each pair there is 1,000 tiny cut garnets. It shows the skill, the craftsmanship that these people were capable of in the early 7th century. They're not imported, they were made locally. The style of them is only found in East Anglia. Now you've got the interlaced boar design on the top of the clasps there. The boar was a totemic symbol of protection to these people, to these Germanic people. You read in Beowulf of warriors going into battle with boar-crested helmets. And the symbol like this would give them added protection in battle.
But who was it who once wore this helmet? We'll probably never know for sure, but scholars have long suggested the name of Raedwald, king of the East Angles from 599 to 624. This fits with the coins which date from the first quarter of the 7th century. According to the Venerable Bede, Raedwald converted to Christianity but still worshipped his pagan gods as well. Certainly the grave has a pagan feel, but also contains items like a pair of christening spoons. The Frankish coins could be significant because we know the Franks were helping bring Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons, but there's also a pagan aspect.
Do we then have 1 coin to pay each of these mystical rowers, and then 2 ingots of gold to pay the ferryman or to pay entrance to Valhalla?
No one knows, but it seems Raedwald was hedging his bets between the pagan and Christian gods. As the poem Beowulf observes, describing a similar ship burial, "No one really knows, neither wise man nor warrior, who it was that received that cargo."